Story 1. I recently found this sub and decided to share a really weird incident that happened to me a few years ago. Here's some quick background. My sister had been living with my grandmother for about a year before her death. She hadn't lived with me and my parents for about 17 years prior to that as well. She was 19 years older than me, creating a big age gap. I was 18 at the time of this incident, and my sister was 37 when she passed away. In April 2016, my sister got us matching sister necklaces for my birthday, the kind that joined together to form a heart or yin-yang symbol. Hers said Big Sis, and mine said Little Sis. She was already wearing her half of the necklace when she gave me mine. In July of that year, my sister passed away suddenly from an accidental drug overdose. She had been struggling with narcotic addiction for a very long time, and it was devastating. A few weeks after she died, my mom and I went to my grandmother's house to collect some of her things. I was determined to find the matching half of our necklaces so I could have both. My mom and I searched through her belongings, turning her room upside down, but we couldn't find it anywhere. We'd already gotten her belongings back from the coroner, and she had only been wearing a watch when she passed, no necklace. My grandmother said she would look for it, but she never found it either. Cut to December of the same year. It was our first Christmas without her. I was putting up Christmas decorations, crying on and off because everything just sucked that year. As I took out the Christmas stockings, I found hers and decided to put it up anyway because I missed her so much. While grabbing her stocking, I felt something hard in the toe. I assumed it was a leftover stocking stuffer from the previous year, so I pulled it out. It was her missing half of the necklace. I stood there in shock, like the wind had been knocked out of me. At first, I thought it might just be a similar looking necklace, but when I saw it said Big Sis, I nearly fainted. There was no logical explanation for how her necklace ended up there. My sister wasn't allowed to be in my parents' house unsupervised because of her struggles with addiction, and she didn't have a key. I'm pretty sure she hadn't visited the house in the 4 months we owned the necklaces before her death. The stockings had been taped up in our garage all year, stored under other boxes and decorations. My parents and grandmother were understandably freaked out. My mom and grandma even cried when I told them. To this day, I cannot explain how or why the necklace got there. While I was thrilled to have it back, I was also a little creeped out. Has anyone else ever experienced something like this? Story 2. My girlfriend and I were driving back from a long road trip, and it was around 2 in the morning. As we drove through a country lane, my headlights caught the side of an object on the side of the road. Thinking it must have just been a sheep, I slowed down, as they can be very unpredictable when startled. As we got closer, we both saw that it was a person sitting on the verge. I slowed down and stopped the car. My girlfriend and I both got out and asked if the person was okay and if they needed any help. The woman stated that she was lost and didn't know where she was. She seemed somewhat frightened, shivering, and not hostile. We asked where she was heading, and she named the next town that we needed to pass through to get home. So I offered to give her a lift. We went over to her. She was well dressed in branded hiking gear, albeit without a decent jacket. Just one of those lightweight packlight ones. She seemed to be in decent shape physically, except for her shivering, and was clean and hygienic. She didn't seem to be homeless either. However, she wasn't carrying a rucksack, so she didn't have any water, a map, or emergency food or first aid kits. We helped her up, and she was actually able to walk and seemed lucid. I didn't suspect any mental impairment from alcohol, drugs, medication, or lack of them. I also ruled out a concussion or psychological issues. But this is where the strange part happened. We got to my car, and she said she needed to relieve herself before we set off. She went to the trees on the side of the car. After a few minutes, my girlfriend shouted her name and asked if she was okay. There was no response. I grabbed the torch from my car and went to search, but after some time, we still couldn't find her. She just disappeared. My girlfriend and I got in the car and looked at each other in disbelief. We rationalized that we hadn't both hallucinated everything at the same time. After all, we'd both physically helped her to her feet and talked to her. I noted the GPS coordinates of our location and reported the incident to the police station in the town she was trying to find. We gave her name and a full physical description and left our details, asking to be contacted with any news. We heard nothing. It just so happened that we were back in that town about 6 weeks later and called into the police station for any updates. There was nothing. No sightings, no reports of a missing person matching our description, and no bodies found. Nothing. We've talked about what happened many times. Maybe she had mental health issues. Maybe she wandered off and got lost again and perished. Or maybe she was found and got back to town. But hopefully, for the love of God, she is safe and well and receiving any help she might require. Story 3. I don't really find it so, but most people I tell it to end up wincing with a grimace on their face and a visible shiver through their bones. I also heard it secondhand, so I can't corroborate or debunk the story, but I find it fascinating if it's actually true. I always feel a little backstory is needed. When I was a baby, not quite 2 years old, my mother got very sick. She went to the doctor and was diagnosed with cancer. The doctor told her that the outcome was bleak, but they would try. People have always survived worse. At this point in her life, she was 42 years old, trying to divorce her useless, druggy husband, who only showed up to steal all her money, and one time kidnapped their baby, me, for ransom. That's another story for another day. She worked 3 jobs, trying to support 7 children in a 2-bedroom apartment. Her 2 oldest could take care of themselves, but they both had difficulties in life and usually needed her help. Her oldest boy, 11 years old, wanted nothing more than to explore the growing medium of video games and play his Sega Genesis. Instead, he was forced to raise his 7-year-old brother and the baby, me. Her 14-year-old daughter wasn't going to help, and her 16-year-old daughter had just had a baby of her own. She didn't have health insurance since her jobs were at McDonald's, another fast food place, and cleaning a hotel. She had no money, but she had designated duties. I don't pretend for a second to understand the things that go through a person's mind when given news like this. Ultimately, she chose the hard way out and let cancer have its way with her. Not that fighting, hitting it with poison, making yourself sick, weak and bald is the easy way out, but to say, okay, I'm going to die soon, and that's all right, is a crazy, difficult decision to make. Humans are very persistent and resilient. We don't give up easily. If we can stand and fight, we usually will, especially to save ourselves or our loved ones. So she did her duty as a mother and sorted out a home for her kids. Her 2 oldest daughters moved out and found places of their own. The 16-year-old moved in with the father of her child and his parents. The youngest was taken in by a cousin. The 2 oldest boys moved in with a sister, and her younger brother went to court and her husband to gain custody of the baby. Now, she was ready. It didn't take long. A few months after the diagnosis, she moved into a hospital and was placed on a morphine drip to help with the pain. At this point, I was well acclimated to my new living situation. I had more toys than I had ever seen in my life, and I played with them all. I was dressed every morning rather than only when we were going somewhere. It took a little while for me to stop going straight to the door after getting dressed. I was used to eating cookies and other sweets that an 11-year-old brother unknowingly thought were good for me. After the move, I ate like a king. Full meals, veggies, fruits, proteins, and carbs. I loved all of it. One day, I was sitting in the living room, pulling toys out of a chest and playing with each in turn. My aunt sat on the couch, watching me play, probably watching TV as well. Across the room, I had one of those toy rotary phones on wheels. The white ones with the smiley face, red speaker, and string to pull it around with you. According to my aunt, the phone started ringing with no one near it. Kind of weird, I know, since I don't actually think they make noise except for the ching when you rotate the dial. But she said it started ringing. After a minute, I walked across the room, picked it up, and said, "Hi, Mommy. Is it time?" "Okay, I know I will. I'll be a good boy and listen to Aunt and Uncle. I love you, Mommy." I hung up, looked at my aunt, said, "Your turn," and went back to my toys. Before I sat down, the house phone started ringing. My aunt answered it. It was the hospital, calling to say my mother had passed away about 5 minutes prior. I don't know if it's necessarily creepy, but I'll let you decide. Was my aunt smoking something? Was my mother's soul really reaching out in its final strength through a toy phone to talk to her baby one last time? Maybe I'm psychic. Or was it just a little boy with more knowledge of his world than he let on, pretending at the right time to talk with his mother? The mother he barely saw for months, and when he did, she looked ages older. Her skin more wrinkled and sagging, her hugs and kisses lacking the strength they once had, her words fewer, and her time spent shorter with each visit. I truly believe kids are a lot smarter than most people realize. Smart enough to know when something is wrong, when someone is sick, when parents are abnormally nice to cover up an impending divorce. Maybe not at 2 years old, but still. Thank you for reading. I hope my story creeped you out or at least gave you an interesting few minutes. Story 4. This happened on a Sunday morning in 1961 in my home area of eastern Kentucky when I was 19 years old. I was driving on a winding mountain road during a light rainstorm on my way to visit a girlfriend at her parents' rural home. I was coming down a steep road, cutting to the left side of the mountain when the car slid into the ditch against the mountain, and then to the left across the road and over a cliff, about 100-foot drop into a creek bed. The car rolled a few times and then landed right side up. I was able to get out with what looked like just a lot of cuts on my arms from glass. I realized I was about 20 miles from town in a lightly traveled area on a Sunday morning when almost everyone was in church. This was years before EMS, 911, cell phones, or similar assistances. I realized I was going to have to climb up the cliff and onto the road, or no one would know I was down there. I bent forward and grabbed a small tree to pull myself up. As I leaned forward, something warm and wet came pouring down my face. I reached up and felt the top of my head. I could feel my skull. I had a huge cut across the top of my head, ear to ear, and my scalp was hanging down the back of my neck. I pulled it back in place and tried climbing again. As I leaned forward, I noticed that up the mountain to the right, about 75 yards away, was an old house built into the side of the mountain with a short dirt road leading to it from the main road. Even though I had traveled across the road in the mountain many times, I'd never seen this house because it was not visible from the main road. There was an old car near the house on that road and a man sitting on the edge of the porch. When he caught my eye, he walked out to his car and backed out to the main road until he was above me. He rolled down the passenger window and yelled, "If you can get up here, I could take you to town to the hospital." He never got out of his car. I grabbed another sapling and began a very difficult climb. I managed to make it up to his car and got in. This was 1961, and the car looked to be about 10 years old. The fellow was about 30 years old, thin, and wearing slacks, a shirt, and a fedora hat. As I slumped down in the seat against the passenger door, he only said one thing during our drive. About 25 minutes into the town of Paintsville, Kentucky. "You're losing a lot of blood. I saw wounds like this in the war, and if you don't stop the bleeding, you'll die. Take my coat and hold it against the top of your head and press hard." He handed me a light jacket that was lying between us on the seat. There are 2 main hospitals in my town, and as we got to the outskirts, he said, "Which hospital do you want to go to?" Since my mother had worked at the downtown clinic, I asked for that one. We were in front in about 5 minutes when he stopped and said, "I can't get out, but do you think you can make it inside okay?" I said yes, thanked him, and made it the few steps inside. I'm sure I left his car full of blood and ruined his jacket. I got my scalp sewn up, 55 stitches, and was given some blood. I was in the hospital for a few days, but thankfully recovered. When I got home, I found that my father had the car pulled up off the cliff. It was totaled, obviously. He said to me, "Now we have to go back out to that fellow's house and thank him and see if we can take care of cleaning his car." When we got to that little road that led to the house where he'd been sitting, things got very weird. First of all, the little road that led to the house was covered up with weeds at least waist high, with no sign that a car had ever even been there. It had only been 3 days since the accident, which was not enough time for weeds to grow that much. I distinctly remember he was parked on that little short road. My dad and I parked at the end of that road and walked through the weeds to the house. It was a simple little frame house that would have had a bedroom, kitchen, and living room with a front and back porch and an outhouse. There was no sign that anyone had lived there in a very long time. Some windows were broken, and there was no furniture. This was an area in the countryside where everybody knows everybody else and their business. As such, I asked my girlfriend's family if they knew who'd lived in that abandoned house and learned it had been empty for a long time. Nobody knew the fellow who took me to town. Well, that's where my story ends. 60 years have gone by, and I've tried to answer many questions about the incident. Why could or would the man not get out of his car? Why was he right there at the house just at the right time? Was he passing through the area? He was familiar with the town he took me to because he knew there were 2 hospitals and knew how to get me to one. He knew how to find the house even though it was not visible from the main road. He must have been a World War II vet because he mentioned the war, and he would have been about the right age. How was his car parked in an area completely covered in weeds a few days later? I've decided either he was sent there to save me, or I was just unbelievably lucky. I could have bled to death before anyone found me, and may not have been able to walk on down to the ravine, where the road met the bottom of the hill. That would have been a long walk with a lot more loss of blood. How was I able to climb up the cliff to his car when I knew he was there, but I couldn't do it before I saw him? Now that I'm 79 years old instead of 19, I have told this true story to several people who have had similar experiences, and they have suggested the stranger was an angel sent to save me. There may be no other explanation